Okay, we're back in early childhood development, and we're going to be talking about gender development. Sorry, I have to hop through the slides from the previous thing. Got to get through this first. So, while I'm getting to my proper spot, I'll just point out that the terminology has changed over the course of the last 100 years in our discussions of gender. When we talk about gender, sometimes we use that as a euphemism for male and female. And so we got to first agree on what the terminology means and what we mean by male and female and things like that. Sex differences are the biological differences. So when I'm talking today, I'm going to use the word sex whenever I'm referring to things that are due to the sex chromosomes that are associated with genitalia, those kinds of things. When I refer to gender, I'm going to be referring to the psychological differences. So when we talk about how different boys and girls really are, it depends on what you're talking about. Are you talking about their sex differences? Well, boys have an X and a Y and girls have an XX, typically. There are different combinations of patterns that can occur that can result in the other thing that we might talk about with sex differences, which is genitalia. Hormone patterns can affect genitalia. Things like that. Gender differences, we're going to be talking about psychological factors. Psychological factors can be influenced by environmental differences and how people are treated or socialized, but they can also be impacted by biological factors like hormone patterns in the womb and hormone patterns after birth and things like that. So it's a very complex interplay between sex and gender. What I can tell you with great confidence is that boys, those individuals who carry an XY chromosome, tend to be more physically aggressive than girls. Girls tend to be more empathetic than boys. Beyond that, I really can't say much about boys and girls being different, because when children are between the ages of 2 and 6, there isn't a significant amount of difference in their intelligence or their speech patterns or any other objective psychological characteristic that we can measure. Children are variable. There's a lot of difference between how kids behave when they're 2 to 6 years old and then how they're going to behave 10 years later. So it's really difficult to make any sweeping generalizations about boys and girls during this age group. Now, I'm going to use the term sex identity. I still have the title gender at the top of the slide, but I'm going to start to use the much more specific language, sex identity. Because when we talk about gender identity, it's suddenly, in the past probably 5 years, has blossomed out to mean something different than what psychologists have historically meant when they've talked about gender identity. I think people used to use the word gender instead of the word sex because sex sounds like, sex. And so they wanted to distinguish that they meant not sexual intercourse, but sex as far as a person's, biological makeup. So they use the word gender to try and be more careful. But now that the word gender has been used in different ways in modern lingo, I'm going to go ahead and use the word sex. And now you all know what sex means because you saw the previous slide. So sex identity is the child's awareness of whether they are male or female. And sex identity is also their ability to label other people by looking at them as either male or female. Sex constancy is the child's awareness that a person's sex is unchanging. So if you are a boy today, you'll be a boy tomorrow, regardless of what you wear or hairstyles or other kind of things. Sex is unchanging. Kohlberg, if you recall from when we were talking about moral development in the last lecture, Kohlberg, just like he developed stages of moral development, developed stages of understanding gender. And I'm going to put my little asterisk here and say Kohlberg used the term gender where we would use the word sex today. So I'm going to say sex, you're going to read the word gender. So number one, our first stage, when we're 2 to 3 years old, children are able to label a person's sex, but only based on appearance. So when children are 2 to 3 years old, they'll oftentimes cue on very superficial indicators, hair length, style of dress, whether they're carrying a purse or not, things like that. so they can label based on appearance. Number two, the stage 2 would be between 4 and 5 years old. Children start to recognize that sex is consistent over time, but not necessarily across situations. So a person may be consistently across time, male or female, but that they may act different across situations. So an individual male may have variations in their behavior. They still heavily rely on appearance when making judgments of other people's sex. So children in this period will sometimes mislabel a person's sex based on cues of, oh, boys don't wear pink, or girls don't have short hair, or other very superficial factors. In stage 3, they finally achieve gender constancy. When they are 6 or 7 years old, sometimes older, children start to recognize that sex is constant across time and across situations. So that even if a person changes their clothes or their hairstyle, even if they're acting different for the moment, their sex is constant and unchanging. So where does our sense of gender come from? The psychological component. Where does gender come from? Well, one thing that has been observed for a really long time is that sons in particular are encouraged to behave in much more masculine ways than girls are encouraged to behave in feminine ways. The sex typing that leads to gender identification is a lot stronger in littler boys than it is in girls. Girls are oftentimes encouraged to explore a variety of expressions and activities and things like that, whereas boys sometimes will get very negative feedback about non-sex typed behavior. So sons tend to be much more discouraged from feminine behavior and encouraged towards masculine behavior. Fathers in particular have a strong influence on a child's internalization of gender. Fathers tend to be much warmer towards their daughters than they are towards their son. They tend to be more accepting of their daughters' behaviors. They seem to have harsher standards for their sons than they tend to have for their daughters. They tend to be more controlling of their sons. They're more directive. They tell them what to do, and they're much more likely to ask their daughters, what do you think, or what do you want? Whereas with boys, they tell them what to do and tell them what they should be thinking more often. Media influences. We watch things on TV, and we read books, and we see movies, and analyses of those kinds of media influences have shown that, in general, things that are directed towards 2 to 6 year olds have powerful, dominant, and authoritative characters being male more than 90% of the time. And so children get the impression that males are powerful, dominant, and authoritative, and then by inference, the opposite being that females are not powerful, they're submissive, and they are, what's the opposite of authoritative? Submissive, I guess. So media kind of sends a message of what a girl should be like and what a boy should be like through the way that they cast characters and write stories. You have the rare circumstances where you have, Dora the Explorer, or you have, a Power Ranger who's pink, and you have occasional violations of these stereotypes, but there's an overwhelming number of male characters who fit these, stronger characteristics. Then there are peer influences. What everybody else is doing has a big influence on what children do. Children are directed towards people of their same age, and they look to them as their primary models for how they should be acting. And so when girls look around and see other girls dressing like fairies and acting dainty, it makes them feel like that's what they're supposed to be doing. And when boys look around and see their peers, digging in the dirt and rough and tumble playing, they feel like that's what they're supposed to do. And if they really don't feel like doing those things, they may feel different and uncomfortable about the fact that they want to do the thing that the other sex is doing. So peers sometimes can really tease us out of things that we really want to do. Peers can give us a hard time. They maybe even escalate, and usually between 2 and 6 years old, it takes the form of asking pointed questions like, I didn't know that boys like to do that, or things that can make a child feel bad about what they like to do because it's been pointed out that maybe I wasn't supposed to like this. Maybe this isn't what I'm supposed to be doing. I would also like to point out other adults have really big influences on children. It's not just parents. A lot of times parents sort of carry the weight of, well, you taught your children to be this way. But in some ways, other adults can be even more influential than parents as far as internalizing gender roles. Here's an interesting graphic that I found on a study where teachers' eye movements were tracked while interacting with their classes. And you'll notice, first off, if you just lump all the boys together regardless of race, you'll notice that they are spending most of their time watching the boys. You've got 23% of the time they're looking at a girl of any sort, and the rest of the time they're looking at a boy. So right off, boys are given the impression that they are deserving of more attention because they're being looked at more. And then this has another layer of interpretation where we break it up by black versus white, and you see that black boys are being watched even more than white boys are. And so that kind of gives the impression that the teacher might be just sort of always on the lookout for a behavior that may be wrong. So they're looking at the children that they think are most likely to do something wrong. And so the child may internalize messages about who deserves more attention, which sex deserves more attention, which race might deserve more attention. And so teachers have big influences on how kids internalize things. Grandparents do also. A lot of times parents try their hardest to raise their children in a very gender neutral way, and then the grandparents will come swooping in and say something or do something or treat them differently. I remember when my daughter was little, this was a long time ago, but when she was a baby, my husband and I decided, well, we're just going to let her express whatever she finds interesting or whatever, and we'll get her whatever toys she seems to want to play with. And so when she was little, we didn't get her any dolls or anything like that. And we got her toys that we were willing to play with her with. And so there were a lot of blocks and trucks and puzzles, because I like puzzles, and just things that we like to do and we wanted to do with her. And so my mom shows up when my daughter's about 18 months old with a doll in tow, because Grandma couldn't believe that we hadn't given the baby a doll yet. And it's just kind of classic grandparenting things where they have their mindset. And she gave my daughter a doll, and I have to confess, my daughter liked the doll. She wanted the doll. But I felt like, well, let's let her explore and see what her options are, what she likes. And I have to say, before my mom showed up with the doll, there was one incident where I found my daughter regarding her trucks as the big truck was the daddy truck, and then the medium-sized truck was the mommy, and then this little small tiny truck was inside the mommy's dump truck part, and the mommy was holding the baby truck. And I was like, I think maybe the baby needs a doll. And so I was already softening on it, and then my mom showed up with it. And sometimes grandparents do those things where they feel more comfortable maybe with typical behaviors than the parents might be second guessing themselves. I have a more age appropriate example though of grandparents having a big influence. When my son was about 3, we were out for a hike, and one of the things that I vowed with my son is that I was never going to make him feel bad if he ever cried, because I felt like boys should be feeling comfortable crying and things. And so we were out for a hike, and he climbed up on this fence and then fell off, and he landed smack on his back, and it knocked his wind out. And you could see that his eyes were just terrified. He's like, oh, couldn't get his air. And so I came to him, I said, it's okay, your air will come back, relax, you're fine, I know it's scary. And my dad immediately says, he's not scared, he's just mad because he fell off. And it's really classic how we will retype male behavior as anger and female behavior as fear, and it helps to sort of fuel that belief that it's one thing or another. And so grandparents can oftentimes play roles. Other adults, people that you just come into tangential kind of contact with, will say things or do things or serve as role models that your child may internalize and you don't even really realize. And so 2 to 6-year-olds have lots of influences, their daycare provider, other sources that may be giving them messages about what boys should be doing and what girls should be doing. And that information all gets internalized into this psychological concept called gender. Now, biology, its influence on gender is going to come partly through the genes, because on average, people who have an XY chromosome have predispositions to have better spatial skills, or to be more physically aggressive, or a variety of factors that can be traced back to brain differences that seem to be mapped out based on how the genes are organized. And so on average, people with an XY makeup will have these masculine structures in their brains that cause them to possibly think and react in a typically masculine way, whereas people who are lacking the Y chromosome, who have two X's, are more likely to have brain structures that support a more feminine way, on average. So genes are certainly going to play a role, and largely through the shaping of the brain. But the brain isn't just a function of some kind of blueprint that comes from chromosomes. It's a function of a genetic predisposition combined with other factors that oftentimes occur during prenatal development. A lot of times when people talk about the role of the environment, they forget that the first environment that we ever experience, that perhaps might even be the most influential in our development, is the environment we experience between conception and birth. Because that's when there's so much development going on in the brain. It's getting organized, it's lining up all of its neurons and getting ready to be born and then to be influenceable by the outside environment. So one of the big factors that can affect brain development prenatally is the hormone pattern that the baby experiences while in the womb. Typically, XX babies have very stable hormonal patterns throughout gestation, and that stable hormone pattern, that lack of testosterone that they experience, causes a feminization on average of the brain that makes it more likely that they'll have, for example, a large corpus callosum, which allows for greater crosstalk between the right and the left hemispheres of the brain. An asymmetrical brain that allows the left hemisphere to be larger, which gives on average better verbal skills. On average, females in the absence of testosterone will have smaller amygdala, which means that they're less likely to have the kinds of flares of aggression that lead to physical aggression. There are about 10 different structures in the brain that have a typically feminine format and a typically masculine format. But you know what? XX babies can be exposed to testosterone while in the womb. It could come from their own adrenal glands in a condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia. So if it happens during a critical period of brain development, that can masculinize the brain of a person who's an XX person. It can come from the mom's adrenal glands. So if mom has a prolonged period of stress where she's secreting a bunch of testosterone of her own, that can cross the placenta and expose the XX baby to extra testosterone. And if that happens during a critical period of development, then the brain can get masculinized. Typically, an XY carrying fetus will have a spike of testosterone about 9 weeks after conception, and that's going to cause the external genitalia. And then it'll have another spike of testosterone about 20 to 24 weeks after gestation, after conception, and that's going to cause the masculinization of the brain, usually. Sometimes the second burst doesn't happen when it's supposed to, and you miss that critical period for development. Sometimes the male fetus develops insensitivity to its own androgens, so that maybe it was sensitive enough to the androgens to create external genitalia when it was developing, but then insensitivity developed and the brain didn't modify in compliance with the exposure to the testosterone. And so you can end up with what looks like a more feminine brain in a person who has XY chromosomes. There are a lot of things that can happen in the womb hormonally that could explain why male and female brains don't all have like a cookie cutter standard way of being. So prenatal development is super important in the development of gender because it predisposes your brain to react to the world in certain ways. So it's not just stuff that happens after birth. All right. Now, one piece of evidence that I have that prenatal hormonal exposure can affect behavior or gender is that very consistently males have a ring finger that is longer than their index finger, whereas females have a pointer finger or index finger that's longer than their ring finger. It's much more common for females to have that long pointer finger, or to have the two fingers be roughly the same length. They have tied these finger proportions back to fetal development. Exposure to testosterone makes the ring finger longer. Absence of testosterone makes the pointer finger longer. So prenatal development shapes our body. Hormonal patterns in prenatal development shapes our body, but also shapes our brain, and may predispose us to look at the world in different ways. All right. So enough on gender, and let's move to peers. For most children, their first actual friend will be at around age 3. And, it's friend in sort of a loose term, because really they don't have a lot of choice in their playmates. They don't have a lot of choice in their friends. They have to rely on things like sharing common activities, or, they are in the same place and come to like each other and start to show affection for each other. In this case, they're walking together and holding hands because they're friends. Or if they're in some kind of circumstance where they get the opportunity to show support for each other. Most commonly, propinquity is what drives friendships during the 2 to 6 year old period. Propinquity is another way of saying proximity, or basically being close to each other so that you have access to each other, so that you have that opportunity to develop a friendship. You really don't have the opportunity to develop affection and support if you don't have propinquity. So that's probably the driving force. Once you're in, let's say, a common activity, or you're in close contact to each other, a lot of times kids are drawn to other kids who are like them. And so you'll notice in these pictures where there's just pairs of people, you'll notice that they pretty much are in same-sex pairs. And that starts pretty early, because kids look around at their peer group and they look for other people who are like them. And then they feel comfortable, showing affection and support for their peer, because they feel like they're sort of like them. So it's not the most complex decision-making process when we're making our first friends. I also wanted to touch on aggression a little bit, because like I already mentioned, boys on average are more physically aggressive, but I wanted to distinguish between the kind of aggression we might be concerned about in especially children in the older end of this age bracket, the 4, 5, and 6 year olds, versus the kind of aggression that we see in the littler kids, the 2 and 3 and maybe early 4 year olds. Instrumental aggression is the type of aggression where the child behaves in what is objectively an aggressive way. They snatch a toy out of somebody's hand, or maybe they bite somebody or pinch somebody in order to get them to let go of the thing that they want. Something like that. We call that instrumental aggression, where they're doing it as a means to get what they want. They aren't doing it to be mean. They just have something that they want, or they want to be put down, or whatever it is, and they use whatever tools are available. And so they aren't doing it to be mean or to harm the other person. And a lot of times kids who are engaging in instrumental aggression don't yet recognize that the other person has feelings, let alone that the behavior that they just did, the biting or whatever, hurt the other person. They really just don't have that kind of empathy yet. What we're more concerned about is kids when they're older displaying true aggression, where they literally are trying to hurt the other person. I'm going to tell you something surprising. When a group of 2.5 to 5 year olds was studied, they found that those who engaged in fighting more between the 2.5 and 5 year old age range grew up to be older kids who were more sociable and competent in the long run. So a lot of times us parents, we try and squelch anything that might look like aggression or selfishness or being mean, but it turns out the kids who stand up for themselves when they're in this younger age group tend to grow up to be kids who are more sociable and competent. Now, something that's missing in this study is whether the kids who engaged in fighting got good feedback about the inappropriateness of their behavior or any of that kind of guidance or support, and that might have been the key to helping them to grow more sociable and competent. But what we do know is that, a lot of times parents get very distressed if their children seem to be getting into fights or, like little spats. They're 2.5 to 5 year olds, and they're not out fist fighting, but they're, having little spats or pushing their will on someone else. They worry that their kid's going to grow up to be a bully or somebody bad, and it turns out that it may actually be a good sign. All right, so now I have to do a little nod to Erikson and his stages of psychosocial development. He says that during this period that we're talking about, between the 3rd year, so that would be kids who are 2, through the 5th year, so all the way up until their 5th birthday, he says kids are in this, the big crisis is between developing initiative or developing guilt. And so kids who show initiative and are encouraged for that initiative, even if they tried to clean up and they just actually made a bigger mess and weren't any help, but they tried. Kids who are encouraged for that kind of behavior will have the favorable outcome, according to Erikson, of becoming self-starters. Whereas if we say, oh my gosh, why did you make this mess, and don't realize that they were trying to clean up, that kind of feedback chronically over this 3-year period can cause them to feel like inadequate. Nothing that they do is really right. They're unable to do even the simplest things, so they may develop a sense of inadequacy. So as you recall, Erikson says that solving a crisis on the positive side makes it more likely that the next crisis can be favorably solved. So that's our nod to Erikson. All right, well, that concludes our chapter on psychosocial development. So I will see you next in the next age bracket.